I'll tell you how I found out about the war. We were in school, and it was 8 o'clock in the morning. This class started. The teacher took attendance, and shortly after that, the door opened, and one of my classmates walked in and said, "Chevre, yesh milchama." Guys, there's a war on.
Yeah, but this is 50 years, right? And a lot of things have happened in 50 years. There's a lot of changes, and a lot of things have shifted from then. And also the numbers of wars since then, the Intifada since then. And we're still in the midst of it. We're in the middle of the story right now. I don't know where it's going.
אני מבטיח לך, ילדה שלי קטנה, שזאת תהיה המלחמה האחרונה.
It was such a victory, and usually that, you would hope anyway, that would be finished, and then everyone would sit at the table and they'll discuss things and try and live peacefully together.
כבדות ממלח וגלים, אני מבטיח לך, ילדה שלי קטנה, שזאת תהיה המלחמה האחרונה.
We were stupid enough to believe that the song of Yoram Gaon about not forgetting that this is the last war, and we all went for that.
And that's when I thought, this is the status quo. I think it's going to just stay like this.
Whoever thought that it would continue on like this?
I cannot believe that we are still struggling for our existence.
ילדה שלי קטנה, שזאת תהיה המלחמה האחרונה.
I think that 6 weeks prior to the day of the war, it was a lot of fear in the countries. People did not know what's going to happen. The Arabs declared that they want to throw us to the sea. Meitzarei Tiran were closed. The tension was very high. All the young people were called to the army. People had a lot of fear. What's going to happen to our beautiful country? Everywhere, people talk, what will be our future? What can we do in order to be safe? At that time, I was a teacher in a place by the name Gan Yavne. Originally, I'm from Rehovot. It means that I had to travel by bus quite early every morning to be in the school in order to teach. On the day of the war, at the beginning, in early morning, everything was as usual. I went to work quite early, the buses were working, but before I reached the school, I heard the siren. I didn't know what to do. I was 9 months pregnant with my firstborn. Do I go to school? Do I go back home? You heard all the aeroplane because Gan Yavne was near a very strong and big army force that dealt with airplanes, Chatzor. So I decided, no, the kids are there and I have a duty to go and be with them and calm them down. Because the siren, as I said before, was on, and it's meant that we have to go to the shelters. I went to the class, we went to the shelter. I can tell you, it was very, very scary because we didn't know exactly what happened. We didn't know that already most of the enemy's airport and all their airplanes were already shut down. My husband, of course, was in the army. So in my situation, I went to be with my parents. We didn't know what's going to happen. Television, we didn't have at that time. So we were relying on the radio and just on the radio. And slowly, slowly, we started to hear about the first few hours of the war and the success of our ADF.
מטעם אלוף עזר ויצמן, ראש אג"ם במטה הכללי של צבא הגנה לישראל, מתפרסם צו קריאה לשירות מילואים ופקודת שירות לציוד.
My husband was recruited to the 6 Days War, and it took a while until the war started. I'm reading one of my letters to my husband in the army. קיבלתי את הגלויה שלך וגם את המכתב. גם ההורים קיבלו את הגלויה. אנחנו כל כך שמחנו לקבל את המכתבים שלך, אין לך מושג כמה שמחנו. Imagine how happy we were. Mom ran all the way to show me the postcard, and she was so happy when I told her that I also got a letter from you, a sign of life. We knew that you are alive. Don't worry for me, because really there's nothing to worry about. I don't have any difficulties with our baby. She's wonderful like usual. She has an enormous appetite and I have a lot of food, milk to give her. In general, I'm very peaceful. I'm very more relaxed compared to all the others who are really panicky. Yes, there are tensions and all kind of stress feeling. We prepare the shelters and there are very, very specific instructions from Haga to the sirens and how to close the windows with newspapers and make everything dark so the enemy will not find us. This is causing a bad mood, and sometimes, of course, I'm very sad, but not more than others. There is a feeling of togetherness, there is a feeling of a mutual trust that our boys in the army will win. They will do their best.
Our unit was a family, indeed. And I think every soldier that serves in the army feels the same way. We were together from way before until we all were released from active military service. I participated in two major battles. One was the stronghold of the Egyptians in the Sinai desert, and the other one was in Elish, was the second place. And that was all our part in the 6 days war.
I'm going to finish the letter because if I'll not finish it now, I will never finish it. I send you lots of kisses, and also from our daughter Karen that starts now to see, and she wants to see her father. Regards from your parents. All my life, all my love, your wife.
We called Federation to see what we could do to volunteer. We couldn't go to Israel because we were still in college, and we asked what we could do to volunteer. They said they needed people to come in and make phone calls and try and raise money for the war. So in the evenings, from the time the war started, we would go down to the Federation office in the Valley in LA, and they'd give us phone lists, and we would be on the phone calling the community, the Jewish community, to see what money they were willing to donate. This is before the day of credit cards, where you take the phone, the credit card number over the phone. They say they would donate a certain amount of money.
And then when the people pledged the money, well, we can't depend on pledges, as you know. They don't always show up. I would get in the car and I'd go to their house and pick up a check, pick up cash, and bring it back to the Federation building. So we did this for the whole time, for about a week.
Days and days. We'd
Yeah.
go to school, listen to the radio, following the progress of the war, go do our work, and then spend the evenings in the offices making phone calls and collecting money for Federation.
Well, it was in the news. The tension was building up between Israel and the Arab neighbors. And it was thought that the war was going to happen. And the Jewish Agency put out an appeal for volunteers to come back to Israel. One of the things that we learned in Habonim that was taught to us is acting on your ideology, acting on your beliefs. So to take responsibility for who you are. And if you believe that Israel needed protection at that time, then the right thing to do was to go back to Israel and to do whatever had to be done. So 4 of us went back from Vancouver, and we arrived, I think, in Israel a few days before the war broke out. And we all ended up on the same kibbutz that we were on before during the year that we studied in Israel, which is Kibbutz Uri. Our responsibility was to do guard duty at nighttime on the kibbutz. We were given a password, a sisma, that we were supposed to ask for sisma, and if somebody came by, they had to reply with the password. But we were there all night long, walking the perimeters of the kibbutz. And theoretically, we were told to shoot if they don't answer. And I have never shot a gun in my life. One night we were woken up to run into the field because it was on fire, and we never knew how the fire was started. Feeling sort of surreal, as if I was in some kind of a movie.
I was living in Jerusalem, and we were a large group of friends, Canadians, Americans, and we were all at the Hebrew University and living there. And we knew that the situation was becoming tense. They had been asking for volunteers to help out because if war was going to be imminent, they would need help within the city because, of course, people were all being sent to the fronts. So I volunteered. I was called upon on the day that the war broke out. Early in the morning, it was quite early, but I was called to the school to escort the children home. And they all lived right on this border. So at that time, Jerusalem was a divided city. There was a very high concrete wall that divided the city, east and west. And they were just crying and upset because they were so confused, they didn't know what was happening, very young children. So I was taking them all to their houses so they would be safe with their families. We didn't know what was happening. We were staying in the basement, about 5 of us, and we were hearing news reports from the Arabs. That was mainly our communication. We were hearing in English from the Jordanian radio, "We are going to drive all you Jews into the sea, and you have usurped our land," and just like horror things coming from the Jordanian radio station. And from the Israeli radio, we were hearing very little. We heard the fighting all day and night, constant barrage of fighting, guns and bombs. We were very, very frightened because we had absolutely no idea how things were going to evolve. It was really very frightening.
When things started looking bleaker and bleaker, the South African Jewish community really came together and did many things to help, raised funds, a lot of the younger people volunteered. The big thing was that while the Israeli soldiers were serving, they were civilian, a civilian army, it meant that there was nobody there to do their jobs. And the most important job that needed to be done was in the fields of the kibbutzim. Fruit doesn't get picked without people, and the weeds don't get pulled unless there are people. And with all the young men being in the army, there was nobody to do the farm work, and so most of us volunteered with that intention.
In 67, I was 16 in high school, and one of my biggest memory was that Nasser, who was the leader of Egypt, closed the shipping out of the port of Eilat and essentially declared war on Israel. I believe the entire world thought that the Arabs were going to destroy the country, that Israel had no chance. Things that made an impression on me was Trudeau was a minister in Canada, and he offered to rescue or airlift the women and children out of Israel. Although I don't recall that anybody inside Israel was afraid or believed that that's a possibility. My mom at the beginning of the war, on the first day, was worried about her sister who lived in Petah Tikva with 4 daughters. The husband, of course, was taken into the reserve. So I took a bus on the first day to Petah Tikva, which was close to the border. Now it's essentially central Israel. And we took a bus from Petah Tikva with my 4 cousins and their mom, and traveled to Tel Aviv, which was supposedly safer, more further away from the border. On the way, of course, there were times where the alarm went on and
We had to go stop the bus, get off the bus, and run into the nearest shelter until the indication that the alarm is over, and then we could get back on the bus and continue our journey to Tel Aviv.
אנחנו נעבור בחושך ובאור, ודגל כחול לבן במצרי טיראן.
The first memory from the war, I was in the infirmary. The night before, we were folk dancing, and I believe we got an announcement, if I can remember well, saying that there was going to be a war and that we had to be really vigilant and careful. And that night, I started to get spots on my back and on my face. So I was taken to the clinic, and so that night my first memory was scratching like this. The following morning the clinic was bustling with people. There was another boy who was I was in grade 7 and he was in grade 11, and he was very reassuring. He had a broken leg, and he and many others right outside my window of the clinic started building a bunker, an air raid shelter. And that's what was happening all through the Mossad, all through the boarding school for the next day. At night I was quite scared, and everybody was always listening to the news all day long, the news, the radios. If you heard the beeps of the radio, you would run and stand right next to that radio to hear.
משעות הבוקר המוקדמות של היום מתחוללים קרבות עזים בין כוחות אוויר ושריון מצריים שנעו לעבר ישראל לבין כוחותינו שיצאו לבלום אותם.
There were constant planes way always above my head, and we used to duck all the time thinking maybe it was the enemy. Kids had to go underneath their desks or find the closest air raid shelter at the time. And I was a little scared, and I remember this student who had the broken leg, Hausher, just reassuring me that we were going to win and it was going to be safe.
I was still a student, and I was working as a summer job for the Government of Canada. And all of a sudden, the announcements were coming in May that things were happening on the borders, and that the soldiers of Israel had been mobilized and would undoubtedly result in another war. The Zionist organizations involved in Western Canada and Vancouver particularly were basically making it known that if young people wish to volunteer and go over in order to basically fulfill various jobs that were vacant because the citizens were mobilized, then they would accept the applications and we could be sent over. And then myself and a variety of our friends made it known that we were willing to leave the jobs that we were in and volunteer for whatever they wanted to have us do when we got to Israel in this period before the war. And a whole number of people that we knew, because we'd grown up together in the Zionist youth movements, namely Young Judea and or Habonim in Vancouver, had volunteered, had left our jobs. We were flown to Montreal. The war actually broke out when we were in Montreal, and so they held us for 3 or 4 days there before they would send the volunteers over to Israel. On the fourth or fifth day of what turned out to be only a 6-day war, they put us on a plane from Montreal, flew us into Lod near Tel Aviv. Sort of an interesting and exciting flight because we didn't know what was going to be there, for us at the other end. But approximately, half an hour to 45 minutes outbound from landing, we looked out the windows and there were several, fighter jets accompanying the aircraft, to land in Lod. And we were taken upon landing in the dark with a total blackout, which is the first time in my various landings in Lod that there were no lights to be seen. Taken to a hostel somewhere near Herzliya and bunked in for the night. And everybody was milling around after some sort of breakfast, wanting to know what was going to happen and who was going to send who where and what was going on. And it was, shall we say, somewhat chaotic, to say the least. Apparent that we had been advised that we would be sent to various civilian jobs in various walks of life to fill in where people had been mobilized and were able to carry out those jobs. Most of which at the time were various kibbutzim which needed to have various workers for harvests that weren't taking place and that were much overdue. So they gave me an address and a location in Jerusalem of an institute for emotionally disturbed kids where the madrichim had been sent to the military, and they were very short-handed. In the meantime, Nancy, with a variety of our friends, she went off to Ein HaShlosha, right across from Khan Yunis on the Gaza Strip. I had a chance to be invited to dinner with then Professor Shulov, whose sidebar activities included being a director and administrator of the Jerusalem Biblical Zoo, which in turn had hardly anybody working there. And so he asked me if I could spend some time, helping them out there. And at that time met Dvora Ben Shaul, and she and I and one helper who was still remaining wound up rounding up scraps from army bases and elsewhere in the vicinity and feeding the animals for at least 5 or 6 days. After a week into this, I managed to take the Shabbat off and hitchhike down to Ein HaShlosha, where Nancy and the variety of the Chevra had been working. Spent a day or two there and brought Nancy and a couple of the Chevra back to be part of this group in Jerusalem. Towards the end of the 3-month period, Nancy and I, who had been a couple for some time prior to our leaving for Israel, decided that we were going to get married. And on September the 12th of 1967, approximately 3 months, almost to the day that we had arrived for the Hitnadvut, we were married in Jerusalem at the King David Hotel on the balcony overlooking East Jerusalem.
Just before the 6-day war, I jumped to the army. I finished my basic training, and then the war was started. Then I took part of this as young soldiers in Israel army and around Jerusalem. And what actually we did there, we support the troops that took over Jerusalem and get to the West Wall. I wasn't part of going with them, behind them to the West Walls. And what we did was supply them with weapons, with ammunition, with food, water, and sometimes we took the casualties out from the area and bring them to the back so the paramedics can take care of them.
Prior to 6 Day War, I lived in an area called Nofiam next to Herzliya Pituach. What was peculiar about this area was that in Nofiam there was a factory, ammunition factory, which posed an additional risk during a war situation, a risk of bombardment, and could result into a huge explosion and doing both property damage as well as human casualties. So the concerns were high. People were nervous. Sirens were going on a regular basis for a while. Although people were concerned, at the same time they were somewhat calm, and they were handling it with great bravery. I was very impressed as a youngster those days. You're insecure, you don't know what's happening, yet the adults guided us in the nicest possible way, so everything went well. The topic of the day, morning, day, and night, was about up and coming, possibly a war. People were concerned about gas attacks, and masks, the possibility of chemical warfare as well. But along with those good news coming from the Israeli channels, there was also negative news, imaginary information, outrageous stuff such as from the Arab side saying we are in Tel Aviv. I mean, we were actually laughing in some ways, it provided some humor because we in the area of Herzliya, which is a stone's throw away from Tel Aviv, we knew that not to be the case. The Arabs were just spreading stupid lies and propaganda. They are in Tel Aviv, they are in Haifa, there was no such thing.
It's interesting, but in South Africa there was no television, so we didn't know very much what was going on. In fact, I read a book this week that said that in Israel, even though the war started in the morning, they only announced it to the public at midnight that night. So, funny enough, when I was working in an accounting office, I don't think we knew there was even a war starting. Didn't have that feeling about it at all. And then we learnt about it very slowly because you had to read newspapers and things like that. And then it was over. So my first impression of the war was actually what happened after the war when they started raising money. The Jews in South Africa, extremely close-knit community. And the word went out, Israel needs money. And they rented the city hall in Johannesburg, very big hall. I went there almost every day for a week. It was full of tables, full of people. All the retailers, manufacturers, wholesalers had donated free everything to sell. And people were just pouring in and buying. And that was a wonderful experience.
Well, when the war ended, we were just ecstatic. We were ecstatic. We were so relieved, first of all, that it was over. We were so relieved. And then slowly, things were evolving. But in the background was Shuli Natan's song, Yerushalayim Shel Zahav. It was just blasting on the radio day and night. And it was a very, very exciting time.
About 10 days after the fighting stopped, and we all went into Tiberia to see an English movie. I think that epitomized what the mood in Israel was. It was quite a remarkable scene. I remember clearly 50 years later sitting in the theater only old men and mainly older women and young children. It started off, the supporting program was in Hebrew, and we had one guy, an American, who spoke fluent Hebrew, and he was trying to translate, but we didn't really know what was going on until the newsreel came on, and it showed pictures of damaged tanks, damaged aircraft, and then it showed a picture of, or a video of, Israeli soldiers entering the old city. And there was the usual chaos of what you could imagine during a war, guns firing and people running. And the scene then showed Israeli soldiers arriving at the Kotel. And that created an impression that is indelible in my mind. Guns were lowered and people stared at the wall, and these young men walked up and touched it, and a few of them were crying. And in the background was Naomi Shemer singing Yerushalayim Shel Zahav. I don't know what the commentator was saying, but slowly the voice of the commentator lowered and the song became louder, and everybody in that theater was crying. I mean, the men, the women, the kids, and even us. It was a remarkable moment, and I think that epitomized what the people of Israel felt at that time. It was, we were living a miracle.
Hour by hour, the newspapers were coming out with news. We took over Gaza, we took over Kakilia, we took over Tulkarim, we're on the verge of entering East Jerusalem, etc. These were all names that we only heard of in history books or in the Bible. So suddenly we were right there. It was undescribable feeling, really euphoric. It was like you're 100 times bigger than your sports team winning the championship. So you can imagine how crazy the fans go when their team wins. But this was real war, not a game.
Been a new government coming into South Africa in 1948. Which wasn't really friendly towards Jews. And everybody had that expression in those days, Israel is our insurance. If we ever have to run, we go to Israel. So by them winning this war, that was a very positive thing.
For the longest time, for the past couple of years prior to the war, there was a downtrend of negativity. People were thinking to immigrate to United States, to Europe and anywhere else, because there was totally constant threat and pressure put by the Arab side regarding annihilating, wiping Israel off the map. So after the war, there was pretty much jubilation that there is a future for this country.
after the war of 1967, I think we had one of the best time in Israel we ever had.
I remember there being a lot of happiness around it being over, and I remember us going to Jerusalem, going to the old city.
To connect it back to your heritage, to the history.
Oh, it was beyond words. You cannot describe that feeling of finally being able to stand in front of the wall.
And everybody felt empowered, felt that there is a future for this country.
I think everybody had this sense of exuberance. It was just thrilling. People were so happy, were so proud of what everybody had done. There was this cohesiveness. It was one family. The whole country was one family. People were smiling. People were friendly. It was a unique situation.
בשם כל חבריי אשר קולם קרא לילות, בשם כל הגייסות והחילות, בשם כל האבות אשר הלכו לקרב נורא, ושרוצים לשוב אליי חזרה, אני מבטיח לך, ילדה שלי קטנה, שזאת תהיה המלחמה האחרונה. אני מבטיח לך, ילדה שלי קטנה,